Hello everyone, hope you guys are doing well. This is FPL Fran and we are back with the Game Week 22 transfer plans. Now of course Game Week 21 is still underway. We still have effectively half the games of football to be played, and unfortunately we have to wait until next weekend effectively to get the results of Game Week 21. So my live rank doesn't really matter right now. Right now I'm in the top 10k I believe, and I have some pretty fortunate results coming, I feel. And I'll discuss through all the sort of key players that I have in my team that I also think would also affect the FPL landscape for all of us managers. And the first thing to talk about, I would say, is, from a Man City perspective, what we actually found out before the deadline, if we just have a look at some sort of my squad as well, is I did make some moves towards Man City players. And as you can see, I did actually go towards Foden. So I am now invested into two Man City players. But the biggest news, as I said before the deadline, was that it seemed like the double game week 25 game between Brentford and Man City was officially confirmed via the Brentford website, which was then subsequently taken down. So actually, when you click on the website link, it does turn into a 404 sort of link. And unfortunately, that link is broken. But people have taken screenshots. I'm sure you've seen it spread on social media platforms. But effectively, we do have that game pretty much 99.99% confirmed. Ben Crellin has pretty much admitted the same. And now what we're waiting for, of course, is the news on Liverpool versus Luton, right? Whether that creates a double game week 25, whether that creates a blank game week 26. And that's interesting because I've left my team in a position where I took out Son for Foden, but actually still have Salah and Alexander-Arnold. I'll talk about the Liverpool players in a moment, but I just want to go through Man City. So the reason why I actually went with Foden initially, just to sort of reiterate, right, is simply because if we get the full sort of confirmation of double gaming 25, I don't feel so bad about Foden's minutes, right? You can look at a game like, for example, the Newcastle one where KDB can come on. Yes, of course, KDB in theory could take away from Foden's minutes, but I do think Foden has been playing exceptionally well. And ultimately, you can see there are positions where both Foden and KDB can interoperate in the pitch together, and I don't see them as like for like substitutes necessarily. You could also see, of course, that, let's say, even though City have depth now, a lot of the depth is around that sort of left wing position. So it's between Oscar, Bob, Grealish, and Doku. That doesn't really affect Foden. Foden, in theory, could take sort of different midfield positions, as can KDB, right? Whether he takes a little bit more advanced position or even, for example, takes away minutes from someone like a Kovacic, as an example. So that's an interesting thing. Another thing to sort of mention as well is I do think Alvarez's sort of time has sort of come up for our teams. I'm starting to get extremely annoyed watching him play, even though I do love Alvarez and he was a big contributor to some really nice green arrows at the start of the season. But he has been pretty unprolific so far, but I think we have to reluctantly own him. And the only thing I would say is probably I'm not really considering him as a captaincy option. But the biggest news, of course, is what is going on with Haaland, right? After the Game Week 22 deadline, we actually found out that there was a small setback with Haaland's injury. Not so severe that it seems like he's re-injured himself, but more so in the case that he's not that close to coming back. And also, one thing I would say is because we've had slightly contrasting reports with Haaland, right? And even the Haaland family, for example, have moved into De Bruyne. I think there's a little bit to be said about this injury being quite serious. And given that obviously Man City don't have, these big Champions League games yet, it does make sense, of course, that they're sort of managing him, as best as possible. We do have, for example, a Spurs fixture. If we just quickly look at, let's say, the sort of schedule fixture-wise for Man City, you can see here, obviously, they do have Game Week 22, of course, versus Burnley, and there's a bit of time, of course, between that and Brentford. But actually, the key thing, of course, is before that Burnley game, there is an FA Cup match between Man City versus Tottenham. And, of course, we can see exactly what happens between Man City and Tottenham in that situation. I think, of course, if Haaland actually comes off the bench and actually miraculously sort of appears for that Spurs game, then we have some pretty high confidence that we should be selling someone like Julian Alvarez on Game Week 22. However, if let's say Haaland is not a part of the squad, right, for Game Week 22, or rather for the Spurs game, then it actually probably calls into question whether he's going to make it for Burnley as a starter. And I think if Haaland is not going to start versus Burnley at home, my concern really is, do we own Haaland at all? If you can see, obviously, the key issue I would say is Game Week 22 and Game Week 24, those games happen pretty quickly between each other. So there's not too much break as you usually would. And of course, if let's say City are actually struggling to sort of manage this Haaland injury, whatever it is, then if you, let's say, can't guarantee Game Week 22, then, for example, knowing that he's going to maybe come off the bench on Game Week 23 just sort of calls into question whether you want to own Haaland at all. Because as we know, it's very likely that they could also blank Game Week on 29. And in general, I think if you look at the run of games between, let's say, 28, 29, 30, even 31, that's not particularly good. And a lot of us are considering things like, for example, wildcarding, right, on Game Week 26, or even wildcarding on Game Week 31. Another thing to sort of mention, too, is on Game Week 25, even though that would be perfect, right, if that double game week was to happen, and of course our full expectations are that it is, my concern, of course, is how do they manage his minutes on Game Week 25? Is he going to be the best option? Look at, for example, the delay between that Chelsea game and the Brentford game. Is he going to get full 90 minutes if the injury is quite severe? So those are the questions that I think we need to ask ourselves already. Can we plan without Haaland? Another thing to mention, of course, is if you've been keeping Salah and Trent in your teams, you can't afford a structure that has players like Salah, Trent, Haaland, unless you, for example, sold some players like Watkins already, right? And you've built up a lot of cash in the bank. Maybe you don't have 8 attackers. But I think for a lot of us managers who don't have insane transfer value, or who don't actually have, let's say, the ability to go own Salah and Haaland and Trent, right, at the same time, I think it actually might make sense to just think about Game Week 25, if it gets confirmed as a double game week for Liverpool, to see that as a captaincy opportunity for Salah instead, to triple captain him, and to maybe go past Haaland. I guess the question, of course, would be, if you don't go Haaland, like, what is your ideal triple up of Man City? And going back to my team, I think obviously the Kevin De Bruyne question is going to be sort of answered by some managers. I think Walker is a bit of a non-negotiable for me. I look at my team now. I think I've got Cash and Colwill, both players that I think are a little bit risky. We saw Cash once again not start, and we saw Colwill, of course, with Chilwell sort of back off the bench. He did sort of replace Raheem Sterling, so he was sort of playing that left wing position as we saw Chilwell start at the beginning of the season. But I do think that sort of puts Colwill's minutes in a bit of a dicey territory, knowing how deep that Chelsea defense is. So my question, I think, to myself is probably, does it just not make more sense to just go Walker, triple up on Man City like this? And maybe I can replace Alvarez with someone like Solanke in the future, and that could give me room, for example, to sort of think about whether I go into Haaland if, for example, it seems like he's actually, managing his load, managing his injury fine, or we actually leave that room for KDB potentially, or forgo Triple City, right? Because if it seems like KDB can't play both the games in the double, or Haaland can't either, then maybe we don't necessarily need Triple City. But those are my sort of immediate thoughts right now. I do think Walker makes a lot of sense, and definitely I don't really want Alvarez in my team long term. As far as Liverpool, the interesting news is that ultimately you've got Trent and Salah, right? Salah, the interesting thing is that they did just recently draw Mozambique, and that's Egypt that I'm talking about in the AFCON. The way it works actually in Egypt's AFCON group is based on, for example, the AFCON structure and the tournament structure. Egypt are, of course, in a group of four teams, and ultimately, even if they get some bad results like they did today versus Mozambique, it's very likely still, in my opinion, that they would actually progress, because I think Mozambique is still expected to be the worst team in this group. And even though Egypt have a tough game versus Ghana coming up next, if they get a decent result versus Cape Verde, I don't really see them struggling actually to get out of this group, because based on the tournament format, the highest ranked sort of third place teams in their groups will still progress to the sort of quarterfinal stage. And so when you look at a team like Egypt, even if they get one good semi-decent result versus Cape Verde, very, very likely that they progress. And that's sort of the situation with Salah. However, that can still mean that he gets knocked out with a very tough fixture in the quarterfinals. And that could mean, of course, Egypt could exit the tournament early. Now, I don't think that should be our expectation so far. I still think Egypt will actually progress. Yes, of course, the Mozambique result was a bit of a shock. They were also at one point about to lose too. But it also shows that I think it shows you the difference, I suppose, between, let's say, how far we expect Egypt to go potentially versus South Korea. Now, this Egypt team can, of course, change their course, just like Argentina did, for example, in their World Cup run. But just a bit of food for thought, because Mozambique were, of course, one of the worst seeded teams in the tournament, and this was a pretty poor result in hindsight. So that's that. In terms of my actual team for this week, if I was actually to review some things, now I have Trent, right? And that's, of course, a question mark. I don't think Trent is coming back for Game Week 21. Now, I might be wrong, and suddenly the Poro points will actually stay on my bench, but I'm very, very confident that I think Trent won't be back for Game Week 21. Liverpool aren't usually a team that like to risk their players. We also saw Trent in Milan in a bit of a retreat, I would say. He was at a fashion event, and very clearly probably not that close to coming back, even if it's next weekend. And so I'm pretty confident I'll be getting those Poro points off from Trent. Worth at least risking Trent, at least. I just don't see Liverpool, for example, looking at Trent as some sort of substitute and using him for 5 to 10 minutes. I really think that's too much of a risk still, and very likely that Poro will play. But that's actually a good landscape, right? Because if, let's say, Trent is coming back for the Chelsea game, I can very easily play him for next fixture. And even though Arsenal away is a pretty tough fixture, if, let's say, double gaming 25 gets confirmed for Liverpool, I can actually see myself keeping this Liverpool triple up here, where we have Darwin, who's still shown to be an extremely effective player. And a lot of people will be also questioning Darwin's minutes. But I think the interesting thing, of course, was that Jurgen Klopp sort of made some press conference comments about why he was not starting the game versus Fulham in the EFL Cup. And actually, the reason was because Darwin had cramps. Now, I do think it's very possible that Darwin could lose minutes in double gaming 25, but I don't think it's worthwhile for me to sort of restructure my team to get Darwin out of the team. If anything, as I said, I do think Alvarez is sort of the one player in my team that I'm not very happy with owning. And if I am spending transfers in the future, it would be for players like Cash, it would be for players like Alvarez, and potentially for Colwill. And of course, we have to sort of assess what's going on with Haaland, because Salah is still my cash cow. We still will actually see the result between Egypt and Ghana, and that should also give us a little bit of a clue as to, for example, how we can expect Egypt to sort of develop in the AFCON tournament. So that's an interesting thing to think about. In terms of captaincy, I did actually go with Palmer captaincy. I saw a lot of content creators go with Saka. I believe on the content creators leaderboard, we had the top 20 basically was 19 Saka captaincies and me with Palmer captaincy. So I'm pretty happy I've gotten away with a nice Palmer game, right? I think he actually had a very creative game, a very illustrative game, but at the end of the day, I benefited from the fact that he's a penalty taker. Now, Saka's still yet to play, so I'm not going to shoot my gun early. I think Saka could absolutely smash me to pieces, but I'm very happy with 10 points. I think that's more than the average expectation for a player on any game week, and I'm happy with it. So let's see what Saka can do. In terms of the rest of my team, as I said, happy that Porro is probably going to come off the bench, and of course, Ariel yet to play. I think I'm in a good position now, as I said, with 2 free transfers next week. So when I look at my transfers, I think the safest thing to do would obviously be to sort of wait exactly with what is going on with the Haaland situation. And if Haaland's not ready to come back, I think the very simple move for me to make is actually just to go out of cash and go into Walker. I really think it's such a simple standard move. I don't think I need to take Cole out of my team, because in reality, I'll still be able to benefit from Colwill versus Wolves and Colwill versus Crystal Palace, even though after that, the Chelsea run basically turns into, an utter mess. And actually, the question, I suppose, if let's say if I take Alvarez out of the team, decide to pursue a sort of non-Haaland structure, which I'm actually, for example, invested in now, that money could actually be used to get another Man City defender. Do I like really doing that and actually getting a triple up of Man City like this? Not really, to be honest. I'm not a huge fan of it. I'd still like to save a little bit more money in the bank potentially if I want to actually change my, for example, forward line around. We have some interesting enablers too, and I do have to save a little bit of money, for example, to, let's say, upgrade Alvarez to Slanky and things like that in the future. And maybe, of course, that could result in Darwin or Watkins leaving the team. I just think that we have a lot of good options now in the forward position, some budget enablers like João Pedro, making the game a bit more interesting. And so that's the landscape right now with my transfer plans. In terms of captaincy next week, if we're just sort of looking at how I would be lining up, expecting, of course, that Salah's not going to come back in time. I can obviously just put him, at the front of my team, potentially just in front of someone who has a tough fixture in mind, like, let's say, Palmer here. Don't think it's going to really change my team substantially. But when you look at the team, actually, with Trent hopefully coming back for Chelsea, which is sort of the targeted and expected return date based on Pep Linder's comments, this team looks very good. And of course, by simply just making one free transfer to go into Walker, I could be thinking about benching one of the players in my team. Let's say if Salah's not coming back for Game Week 22, which, as I said, is very, very unlikely, then we can simply just play Walker ahead of Palmer. Do I necessarily want to be benching Palmer? Maybe not. But we also have to see exactly what's going on with Julian Alvarez's situation too. I do think this is probably the best lineup that I have possibly. Maybe I could also think about benching Gabriel versus Nottingham Forest away, just because it's an away fixture and I'd prefer Walker, Burnley at home, that sort of situation too. And that's going to be the sort of Game Week 22 transfer plans. Generally speaking, captaincy-wise as well, I think it's between a Man City player, really, because I don't really see some elite options. Maybe you could argue Richarlison could be an interesting option, but I think with Maddison coming back, I'm a little bit fearful that could take away penalties from Richarlison. So do I see him as the best asset in this week? Not necessarily. Maybe, of course, it's a Julian Alvarez captaincy. I think it's just simply between Foden and Alvarez right now, which is why you can see my vice and sort of regular captaincy sort of being put here. And that's pretty much it in terms of my prospective team selection. Keep in mind, of course, that I will be using one transfer at the bare minimum because I don't really want to be rolling 2 free transfers. So that's it. And thank you guys so much for watching. As I said, stay tuned to Haaland news. They are supposed to be expected to train one more week in Abu Dhabi or Dubai. I'm not quite sure, but definitely some sort of hot weather training camp for City is due, and we'll see exactly what happens with Haaland. And of course, the Spurs game in the FA Cup is the most illustrative. And once again, I would not make early transfers if your transfers are based around players who still have one game to go. So, for example, if you're looking at someone like Bowen, right? He's interesting because you're looking at let's say FA Cup tie for West Ham in the future. If you're looking at Man City, as I said, this is the Spurs game. Even Liverpool, for example, will have games, and we, of course, will get press conference updates. We'll also get AFCON and Asian Cup updates too, which should also change the landscape of FPL, not to mention potential double game weeks and even blank game weeks being announced. So thank you guys so much for watching as usual. Thank you to the members of the channel for financially supporting me, and I hope you guys have lovely weeks and also a lovely remainder of Game Week 21. So I'll see you guys very shortly. Take care and goodbye.